Well, howdy, I'm Jim Dunham. I'm the Director of Special Projects and the historian for the Booth Western Art Museum, which is where we are. We're sitting in the Members Lounge of the Booth Western Art Museum here in Cartersville, Georgia. We're a 120,000 square feet museum. We are devoted to the art and the paintings and the sculpture of the American West. And we tell America's story is what we do. And we have 8 galleries that are set up. And because Western art is storytelling, we basically set the galleries up by how the stories are told. We have one gallery that deals with the very earliest artists that traveled out west and painted the frontier movement. And then we have contemporary cowboys and ranching. We have period old-time cowboys. We have American Indian stories and history. And it's just a museum that really is special. So I was raised at a time in which the Westerns literally dominated the entertainment world, the entertainment industry, and we saw in the 1950s, 1960s, at the time that I was really growing up, Westerns really controlled and dominated entertainment. In the 1960s, for example, there were 30 television Westerns a week. And in a single week, on television, you could see Shane and High Noon, Have Gun Will Travel, Rawhide, Sugarfoot, Bronco, Link, Colt 45, Trackdown, Bonanza, Big Valley, The Virginian, The Rifleman, Bat Masterson, Wyatt Earp, and Gunsmoke every single week. So it's obvious that these things influenced the things that those of us in my age bracket remember fondly and like. But the truth of the American West is also something that doesn't really get reflected in television shows. Gunsmoke, for example, Matt Dillon was a United States Marshal, and yet he never did anything that was related to United States Marshals. He behaved like a town chief of police. He behaved like a city marshal, and he never went out and did United States Marshal things, and just stayed around. And he also only had one deputy. He had Chester or Festus, and in reality, in Dodge City, for example, at the time that the Gunsmoke was supposed to take place, which would have been probably the 1870s, the law system was pretty complex. There would have been, first of all, there would have been sheriffs. There would have been a county sheriff, Ford County, in Dodge City had Ford County. I don't know where Chevrolet and those other ones were, but Ford County had a sheriff and his deputies. Bat Masterson was the most famous sheriff of Ford County. And then the town marshal, or chief of police, he had deputies and assistant deputies. And Wyatt Earp was never the marshal. He was always an assistant marshal or a police officer. He worked for Charlie Bassett or someone else who was Larry Deeger or somebody who was the marshal and did all the paperwork and ran the jail, and so Wyatt and his brothers were part of the system. So Matt Dillon shouldn't be all by himself, and he shouldn't be a United States Marshal all by himself. Although many times United States Marshals' jobs, because there were so few times that they had to actually go out and do the federal government stuff, that badge was given to somebody who was a town police officer, town marshal. Good example is Virgil Earp. Virgil Earp in Tombstone, Arizona, was the chief of police. He was the town marshal, but he was also had a badge and paperwork that allowed him to be a deputy United States Marshal. Crawley Dake, who was the marshal for Arizona Territory, had appointed Virgil as a acting deputy United States Marshal. And if something came along that fell under the category of federal crimes, he could do it. So the Old West, of course, has lots of things that are not true in the movies. The American people, when they started this country, were basically farmers. And in the early days of the building of the country, the eastern colonies, they had small farms. People had cows that gave milk. They raised chickens. They raised pigs, and they raised vegetables. And there wasn't the ability to have big cattle ranches in the original colonies on the eastern part of the United States. When the Civil War took place, you got thousands and thousands of people who now are in a battle situation, and you have to feed them. You have to take care of them. Well, you can only feed so many people with a chicken. You kill a chicken and you can only feed so many people. But you can kill a cow and feed a lot of people, beef. The other thing, of course, is that we were a tea-drinking society. Go back to the fact that the original colonies were started by people from England and from Europe that essentially were tea-drinking people. Look at the Boston Tea Party, all the big fuss over the throwing tea into the water. But tea doesn't keep you awake as much as coffee does. And Arbuckle's coffee produced a coffee that could keep you awake. And so over the period of the years of the Civil War, they killed beef and served coffee. And by the end of the war, the country had moved from a chicken and pork eating diet to a desire for beef and a desire for coffee. And that opened the door for what would become the cattle drive era. And the cattle drive era really begins when Joe McCoy from Illinois goes to the Kansas Pacific Railroad and says, if you will build a railroad spur to a little town called Abilene, then I'll go down to Texas, I'll gather up longhorn steers, put them into groups of 2,000 or 3,000 cattle at a time, walk them up the Chisholm Trail, the Goodnight Loving Trail, the Western Trail, the Texas Trail, Shawnee Trail, and take them to the railroad, load them on the railroad cars, ship them to Chicago, St. Louis, and start to provide beef for people who had now developed a taste for beef rather than for chicken and pork. It was the beginning of the trail drives. And in the next decade, over 5 million head of cattle walked up those various trails to the railroad. And the towns that were built where the rails stopped, the railhead towns, they became the towns where so much Western history took place and where gunfights took place because of the fact that these communities were simply dominated by young single men. And these men were acquainted with violence. They had come out of the Civil War. And so these towns, they basically had lots of gambling casinos or gambling halls. They had saloons. They had houses of prostitution. All of these things, wide open stuff that happened in these towns. Abilene, Ellsworth, Hayes, Ogallala, Newton, Dodge City. As the rails moved further west, the towns built up further west. Somebody told a story about a fellow got on a train in Chicago, and the conductor said to him, he says, where do you want to go? And the guy says, I just want to go to hell. He says, well, give me $10, get off of Dodge City. And so it was hell on wheels. The law was simple. What's good for business is legal. Well, that wasn't quite that simple, because there was always laws. For example, it was against the law in towns like Dodge City. It was against the law to have prostitution. And so as a result, the police department would go in and arrest the prostitutes, bring them before the court, and they would charge them $25 for illegal prostitution, and then tell the girls that they need to get back on the street where they belong. So the money that was collected from prostitution paid the salaries of the police officers, and of course it was a constant thing. So there was always laws. What's so interesting about the gunfights in the movies, somebody shoots somebody, and the other person says, well, he drew first, so I had the right to shoot him. Everybody says, oh yeah, that makes perfectly good sense. No, it's not that easy. Almost in every case of somebody getting shot and killed in a gunfight in the Old West, there was legal repercussions. Now, because the law was far and few between, And because the law was abstract in many, many ways, a lot of times it did result in, say, a judge or a justice of the peace looking at the situation and determining that, yes, self-defense or whatever means that you don't follow through with the legal process. But many times these things went to court. A good example is what happened at the OK Corral, the vacant lot gunfight, or what became known as the OK Corral Gun Fight. That was followed by 30 days before Judge Spicer in a hearing to determine whether or not the police officers had behaved in an abusive police brutality way. It's amazing how similar it was to the world today. You know, we see these things happen in our world today where a police officer shoots somebody and then it's followed by all this legal stuff. It happened there. Wyatt Earp had to go hire Thomas Fitch, one of the better lawyers of the day, and they had to testify in before Judge Spicer about what happened. And everybody disagrees. Everybody's telling the Clantons are saying one thing and the Earps are saying another thing, and so Judge Spicer has to make a decision. And Judge Spicer, at the end of 30 days, you know, you got a 30-second gunfight in which 3 men are killed, 3 men are wounded, 3 men run away, and then you've got a 30-day trial or hearing to determine what happened. And at the end of that, Judge Spicer says that Wyatt Earp, Virgil Earp, Morgan Earp, and John H. Holliday are not guilty of a crime because they're police officers doing their duty. And so it's amazing how similar it is to the world today. There are examples, however, where you could actually get away with shooting somebody in the back, or you could shoot somebody from ambush and also get away with it. Not necessarily was that written in law, but it did happen. And a good example is the situation with John Wesley Hardin and other cases where they testified and got away with it. One of the examples is Wild Bill Hickok. Wild Bill Hickok is killed by Jack McCall August 2nd, 1876. He's in Deadwood, South Dakota. He comes into Carl Mann's number 10 saloon and they're playing poker, and he says, the only chair has its back to the door. Would somebody mind, changing me with me and let me sit with my back to the wall? And Carl Mann and the other fellows at the table said, come on, don't be silly. Just sit down and play cards. So Hickok takes a chair that exposes his back to the room. Jack McCall sees his opportunity to be famous. He comes in and he shoots Hickok, and Hickok dies. Many people say that the last poker hand that he had was a pair of aces and a pair of eights and either a red face card kicker. Nobody knows for sure. That information did not arise at that moment, but it's very likely that somebody looked at his hand, partly to see who won the money that was on the table, although I assume all the money that was on the table probably went to pay for Hickok's funeral. But anyway, Jack McCall is arrested. He's brought before a kangaroo court of miners, because this was a mining town. And he says in his trial, he says that Hickok had killed his brother, so he killed Hickok in vengeance. And everybody said, well, that makes sense. That's perfectly valid. And they turned him loose. And of course, later on, he's rearrested because Deadwood, South Dakota does not have the right to make a trial in a capital offense. And so he's taken to Yankton, South Dakota, which is the territorial capital. He's retried, in which they prove that he never had a brother and Hickok never killed his brother, and it was basically a situation where he wanted to be famous by killing a famous person, and fortunately the decision was reversed. It was not considered double jeopardy, and they hanged him by the neck until dead. In the case of John Wesley Hardin had, of course, created a situation. He was a character. He was a disreputable kind of guy, and he had a girlfriend. His girlfriend was arrested when he was out of town. His girlfriend was arrested for being drunk and disorderly, and John Selman Jr., who was the police officer, had thrown her in the drunk tank, and he came back to town. He was of course a lawyer at that time. He had passed the bar, and he was practicing the law, and he came back and he was all upset. And he said this officer should have known that that this woman is my girlfriend and therefore should have been escorted home rather than locked up in jail. And so he rants and raves and makes a big fuss. And his dad, the officer's dad, John Selman Sr., gets real enraged. He comes into the saloon and walks in, and John Wesley Hardin is standing at the bar. And in fact, he's got a little container of dice, and he's playing the dice game with the bartenders as he was going to pay for the drinks. And so he walks into the Acme Saloon. The last words out of Hardin's mouth before he dies, he throws the dice out and he says to the bartender, he says, "You got 4 6s to beat." And at that moment, John Selman shoots him in the back of the head. The bullet enters the back of his head, comes out about there, and he goes to court and he pleads self-defense. He tells the judge, he says that he had caught John Wesley Hardin's reflection in the window or in the mirror, and he knew that Hardin was so dangerous with a gun that unless he shoots first, he's going to die. And so he decided to shoot first. And so before John Wesley Hardin had a chance to pull one of his pistols, he shoots him in the back of the head, kills him. And of course, what happens is that the judge says, "Well, that makes perfectly good sense. It's exactly the right move and the right thing to do," and he lets him go. Unfortunately, if you live by the sword, you die by the sword. And so he did not get not to live very long because he himself got into a gunfight with Scarborough Selman, and it turned into a fiasco, and he gets killed. Another good example was the Wild Bill Hickok when he killed Phil Coe, and that was a gunfight in which he had told Philip Coe he was shooting his gun off in town in Abilene, and he comes around and he says to Phil Coe, "What are you doing?" And Phil Coe says, "I'm shooting at a stray dog." And Hickok says, "It's against the law to shoot stray dogs." And he says, "Well, maybe it's time to start shooting at Yankee Marshals." And when he pointed his gun, Hickok pulled his .36 caliber Navy revolver and put a bullet into Phil Coe. And then he hears behind him a sound, and we're not sure whether it's just the sound of somebody running or maybe it's the sound of a Colt revolver being cocked. But whatever it was, he heard that sound. He wheeled and he fired, and too late he realized it wasn't one of Philip Coe's friends, but it was his own friend and deputy, Mike Williams, and he wound up killing his own friend. The Code of the West basically said, and they pretty much had a code. The Code of the West said you weren't supposed to legally shoot anybody in the back. You weren't supposed to shoot anybody who refused to fight. You weren't supposed to shoot anybody that was unarmed. But the nature of the time in these cattle towns and in these mining towns, where the law was far and few between, and where people all carried firearms, many times against the laws, because sometimes the laws in Tombstone, for example, were stricter in 1881 than they are today about carrying firearms. But the law basically allowed for you to defend yourself under almost any other situation. For example, if you could prove that somebody had gone around and threatened your life, if you could bring witnesses forward and said that this person that you killed had been threatening your life and saying things about wanting to kill you and wanting to shoot you on sight, you could legally hide behind a building and wait for him to come around the corner, and if he was armed, you could turn and say, "Hey, bang," shoot him, he falls dead, and you've given him no chance at all. But because he had threatened your life and because he was armed and prepared to fight, you could probably win a self-defense charge, and that happened on a number of occasions. The gunfighters of the Old West were not like the movie guys where they made a living out of being a gunfighter. There were really, for example, you couldn't make a living out of being a bounty hunter. The problem with the stories in the movies that says the bounty hunter is able to be a bounty hunter because the police officers can't accept the bounties. And so there's always a scene in the movie of bounty hunters where the marshal or the sheriff says, well, you're a terrible person, you're a bounty hunter, but because I'm the marshal, I can't accept any of the reward money, therefore you exist in order to get the reward money. Well, that's baloney. Almost all of the reward money that was provided by anybody, Wells Fargo or whoever, for people who were criminals, almost all of the reward money went to police officers doing their duty. If they would capture an outlaw, or they would do whatever, and they would share in the reward money if it was provided. And so you didn't have a bunch of people going around making a living as bounty hunters, but you had peace officers who certainly were aware that arresting certain people could bring income to them. But the legal system was such that there was almost always repercussions for shooting people. There was almost always something done, although it didn't necessarily follow that you'd have a fair trial or that you would have this kind of thing. The mining towns were the other example. Cattle towns and mining towns, almost always connected to gambling. Because wherever you've got gambling, you've got the potential of trouble. Cowboy has been on the trail for 100 days. And after 100 days of no days off, working every day, he's paid off in cash. He has now, like, if he worked $1 a day, he's got $90 or $100 in cash. The first thing he's going to do is go get a shave and a haircut, maybe a new set of clothes, and check into a hotel, get a bath, get a nice dinner, and then he's going to go to one of the saloons, have something to drink, and gamble. And a couple hours later, he has lost 3 months' worth of wages, and the girl that he thought he was going to go home with has gone with somebody else. He's ready for a fight. And if he thinks he's being cheated at cards, all hell breaks loose. Many times, the men who were the professional gamblers, they encouraged a reputation because the reputation would make people back away. You know, some of the movies, like the movie The Fastest Gun Alive, the idea was that if you had a reputation for a fast gun, that people came from all over to challenge you. That was the Glenn Ford movie, The Fastest Gun Alive. That if you were the famous person who was famous with a gun, young kids would come and challenge you. Gregory Peck made a movie called The Gunfighter. And what's interesting about the movie The Gunfighter is Gregory Peck never draws a gun in the movie. They film it in such a way that whenever Gregory Peck is standing at the bar and the kid says, "Oh, I think I can beat you," his name was Jimmy Ringo. He says, "I think I can beat you, Ringo." And Gregory Peck says, "No, I wouldn't do that. That's not, people have tried that and didn't work out." And then the kid goes for his gun, and you see the actor pulling his gun, and then all of a sudden the gun goes off in the hands of Gregory Peck, bang, and the other guy falls dead because he challenged Jimmy Ringo. Not only does Gregory Peck not have to outdraw that guy, the other actor, he doesn't have to be there that day. He can film it. He can film it at a different day. He comes in and he says to the director, "What do you need from me?" He said, "Well, we need 2 shots. One where you're standing at the bar, one where you're firing the gun, and we'll just clip in and we'll splice in the other stuff in between, and everybody will assume that while you're watching the kid go for his gun, that you're going for your gun." Well, not only is that concept wrong, the idea that if you're fast with a gun, famous with a gun, that people come and try to challenge you, but just the opposite was true. If you had a reputation for being a dangerous man, somebody like Doc Holliday, somebody like Wyatt Earp, the chances are anybody who has the possibility of questioning whether you're being cheated at cards, you think twice, because you'll say, "This man could kill me. This man has a reputation for killing people." It's an interesting thing because the gunfighters of the Old West really, for the most part, are people who have other jobs. They don't have a job as a gunfighter, but they have a reputation for their skill with a gun. How important was it to draw fast? Not that important. Wyatt Earp supposedly told his biographer, Stuart Lake, that the most important thing to do in a gunfight is to take your time in a hurry. And Bat Masterson wrote a series of newspaper articles for Human Life magazine in 1907. He said there were three things that made the gunfighters dangerous. He said the least important was speed with a gun. The second least important was accuracy. Now you think about that. If speed is the least important and accuracy is the second least important, what on earth could be more important? And the answer was what he called deliberation. And what deliberation was the ability to make decisions under stress. And you don't get much more stress than when somebody's shooting at you. Deliberation was the ability to stay calm and make decisions under stress. That was the ability that people like Wyatt Earp and people like Virgil Earp and people like Doc Holliday had at the vacant lot gunfight in Tombstone, is they stayed calm and remained calm. If you could take the time to actually point your gun correctly and line up the sights in the middle of a shootout, the chances are you could remain alive. You didn't have to be faster. Gunfight at Ok Corral supposedly lasted 30 seconds. Some, maybe as much as 30 shots were fired. So how important was the first draw? Well, if it hits something, it's very important. But the likelihood is that the fastest draw would miss before the fastest draw would hit. It's better to slow down. A good example is Levi Richardson in Loving in a Dodge City situation. Levi Richards comes in blazing away. Cockeyed Frank Loving simply kept his time, took time, lined up his gun, fired once, and Richardson falls dead. It's a completely different scenario than what the movie industry has portrayed. This era that really was reflected in the 1870s, 1880s, pretty much comes to a conclusion by the end of the century. Not that there isn't still violence, not that there aren't still gunfights, but as the world began to move and as the United States began to grow and as these cities were incorporated, families started to move in, you started to have churches, you started to have schools, all of a sudden the reliance on saloons and brothels and things like that kind of were dismissed and became part of the bigger society. The gunfight era kind of comes to a conclusion. And along with the end of the era, you're moving on to ranches and away from casinos and gambling and shootouts. If you're interested in this subject matter, by the way, you need to be part of the Wild West History Association. And the WWHA, of which I'm the current president, has one of the finest journals, a quarterly journal of actual documented historical writing. Every single journal deals with famous and not so famous people or people you've never heard of that played a part in the history of the American West, the frontier. These are the characters of the Old West and the Wild West. So you're going to love the journals. And we get together once a year. We have an annual roundup, and we bring in the experts to give talks and lectures about the characters of the Old West. We have bus trips to go visit places. Like we went to where the famous gunfight between Wild Bill Hickok and Dave Tutt took place. One of the few times that two men faced each other in the street and actually had one on each side in a gunfight situation. So this coming year, we're going to be in the first week of September. We're going to be in Fort Smith, Arkansas. This is where the hanging judge spent his time, Judge Isaac Parker. It was the entrance area to the Indian Territory of Oklahoma. And this is the kind of place where stories like Portis's book, True Grit, takes place. So if you're interested in characters of the Old West, Western movies, take a look at wildwesthistory.com or .org, wildwesthistory.org, and take a look and see just what you might be able to enjoy by being a part of the Wild West History Association. The Old West was a fascinating time, fascinating place. And of course, it also is a place that lives in our imagination. We hope that you enjoyed our time here at the Booth Western Art Museum, and if you get a chance to get to Cartersville, Georgia, come see us at the Booth Western Art Museum. and come see us at the Wild West History Association.org. I'm Jim Dunham. Have a good day. Happy trails.